Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another Potted History. I told you I'd have one at some point in the future, and here it is. These are a series of videos where I take historical places or events and present them to you in a brief yet detailed fashion over the course of about 20 minutes or so. You may have seen that I have done a series of Potted Histories a couple of months ago where I took events that either correlate or resemble what's been going on now in 2020, and also taking events that have been celebrating significant anniversaries. And obviously I've done a couple of others even further behind that on Stirling in Scotland and down in Winchester in England. But for this week, I'm going to take another one of those significant anniversaries, because today I'm talking about the Battle of Britain, which this year celebrates its 80th anniversary. A period during the Second World War where the Germans tried to push us or assault us here in Britain into submission and into an embarrassing peace treaty, as it were. So without further ado, here are those brief yet detailed fashion events in this next scene. This next bit. Now, the Battle of Britain was both a battle of the skies and a battle of the seas, a period which lasted from the 10th of July until the 31st of October 1940. Now, concurrently with these events, and maybe slightly after as well, was a series of air raids and assaults day and night on major cities, commonly known and most well known as the Blitz, which lasted from the September of 1940 until the May of 1941. However, German historians don't divide these two categories. They don't class the Blitz as a separate entity to the Battle of Britain. They lump them all together in a period from July 1940 until June 1941, this one big sort of battle of Britain, or an assault on Britain. Now, June 1941, because that was when the German high-ranking command decided to ditch all attempts at trying to conquer Britain and instead focus their attentions on the Soviet Union in their Operation Barbarossa. Now, returning to the English definition of the Battle of Britain, this July to October period, preparations were well underway for a German assault on British shores by the previous month of June 1940. The fall of France was inevitable. The Germans had been quick and decisive in their assault through Western Europe, and since the evacuation of almost 300,000 soldiers from the Dunkirk beaches, the next sure target would be Britain. Winston Churchill went on the airwaves and made a speech on the 24th of June saying that the Battle of France was over and the Battle of Britain was about to begin. Now, this terminology, the Battle of Britain, comes from this very speech on the June 24th. But although preparations were being made, manufacturing into aircraft and defences and weaponry were going in full swing, nobody really knew at what point the Germans would start their assault. And some have suggested that if the Germans had been quickly and more swift in their attacks on Britain before this sort of July 10th start date, then they probably would have had a better chance of conquering and putting into place their ideas for Britain. But obviously they didn't do that. So the Battle of Britain comes in four separate waves, and I'm going to read this out because there are some German pronunciations here, and I apologise if there is anybody who is German watching. So between the 26th of June and the 16th of July, something called Storengriff was implemented, sort of mine laying, recon and small-scale attacks on small airfields and ports in Britain. These were also, Sturmgriff means nuisance raids. These were stepped up a gear by the middle of July until the middle of August 1940, when they enacted their Kanalkampf, or their channel battles, where the Germans attacked shipping, they attacked ports and coastal airfields along the British coasts. Because the way they saw it is that if you knock out the British Navy, one of the so-called best in the world, and you knock out their great sort of RAF airfields and munitions, then you'd be easily able to cross over the channel from France onto the south coast of Britain and push upwards. Now, in the third wave, which is called the Adlerangriff, which is like the eagle attack, this was sort of the main assault between sort of mid-August and early September of 1940. This was literally just a large-scale attempt to destroy any sort of RAF base and airfield on the south coast. Day raids on airfields and night raids on the industrial parts, or in the industrial cities in Britain. And then obviously you have the Blitz, which is more sort of sustained day raids and night raids, because by the time you get to the September of 1940, the Germans were starting to realise that nothing was really working. You know, they were assaulting the British airfields and they were assaulting the shipping and the ports and all that, but nothing was happening. The British were able to keep up with manufacturing all of these aircrafts and were able to use radar systems to spot when German Luftwaffe Messerschmitt planes were flying over, so that they could easily pull together, fly up and respond to this attack and this assault. But the Germans were so assured of their own success in the early phases of the Battle of Britain that they began planning in the July of 1940 their own land assault against the British. To prepare for this, extensive training was utilised. Specialist equipment was made and vehicles were adapted for the chalky grassland of the south coast of England. All so that on September the September date, 1940, they could finally make their move and assault the British shores. Now, I'm going to refer up here to a moment, so bear with me. So what the Germans were trying to do is they were trying to utilise the sort of Belgian and French coast in order to gain multiple access points into England. So they were going to assault from Ostend in Belgium, sort of right on the coast, right on the sort of border. Places like Dunkirk and Calais were also two major points in which to get into the UK. And then you had sort of lesser known places like Boulogne, which is sort of in the middle, Le Havre, which is another sort of major entry point into the UK, sort of down here on the sort of the curvature, and then right at the bottom, so you have the city of Cherbourg. Now, from these points, there were 5 sort of entry zones in which the Germans were going to take. They were going to take Ramsgate, which is sort of slightly off-screen, sort of by the River Thames, obviously Dover-Folkestone area. They also had places like Brighton and the Isle of Wight, and then as far sort of west as Lyme Regis, which is in sort of the county of Dorset. There was nothing in Cornwall and that sort of tipped bit of England that you often see. There was no sort of attack plans there. What the Germans were trying to do is they were trying to sort of portion off a square as such of the English territory and then sort of push up. What they were going to do is they were going to push up to places like Gloucester and Oxford, Malden and obviously London, and as I said, sort of cut off England from, cut off this southern section from the rest of Britain. Now, it's all very well and good trying to assault the UK or Britain from the coast of Belgium and France, but the problem that an invading force like the Germans had to face was the English Channel. The The English Channel is a temperamental body of water. The winds can be incredibly rough and the seas can be choppy. Even in today's modern ferries and technologies, the seas can still be quite rough crossing from Dover into Calais and vice versa. So the Germans planned for a September assault date, right? We knew that. But when these problems presented themselves in the Channel, they decided to postpone it to an early October date. But when that date came, they didn't go anywhere. They postponed it for another couple of weeks to late October. But even then, they still didn't really move or didn't do anything. This is probably because the main sort of eagle assaults that they were making on British cities and trying to suppress and destroy the Navy and the RAF capabilities, just not working. So that's probably one of the reasons why they didn't move initially. But also, probably one of the biggest factors is the fact that heads of state, Hitler and Goering and many in the High Command, started to lose interest and lose the sort of hope and success of conquering Britain. They were hopeful that an initial assault and these plans of assault would work and that they would get into Britain quite easily, like they had done with France. But obviously, as time wore on and as the RAF kept coming back and kept repelling the German aircraft of the Luftwaffe, they started to lose interest and they started to think that this wasn't going to work as well as they had hoped. By 1941, by the May of 1941, the German High Command decided to ditch attempts at conquering Britain and move their assault eastwards towards the Soviet Union. An assault that would be called Operation Barbarossa, which was devastating for the Russians because many people died and they were somewhat unprepared for this assault, having signed a treaty with Germany at the beginning of the war. But it would be even more devastating for the Germans for not taking into account the Russian weather and the Russian conditions. And it's one of the biggest defeats of the German army. Now, one could say that the Battle of Britain was the German army's first defeat and was one of the sort of turning tides of the war. But some others would suggest that the Operation Barbarossa was more sort of defeating for the Germans because it was such a devastating move and a devastating point in history. Now, the civilian population in Britain was caught up in these terror raids by the Luftwaffe in their Messerschmitts during the sort of latter stages of the Battle of Britain. And it was during this period that acts of heroism were conducted by many civilians. 20,000 people had died and 14,000 more were injured. But everybody was, in effect, their own hero. They were either combating the Germans in the skies or they were combating the effects of the bombings on the ground. After the Battle of Britain, the royal family, who had an opportunity to leave Britain and move to Canada, sort of to escape the conflict, they decided that they would create an award system called the George Cross, a medal that was given to anybody, any civilian in the UK or a UK citizen who had performed an act of bravery. This system, this George Cross, still runs to this day. I mean, very few people get it anyway, but it was just the sheer acts of heroism that were done during this period of the Second World War needed to be commemorated and remembered and honoured in some form. And that is where we get the George Cross from. Now, sort of just some final statistics before we sort of finish up this potted history. There were 2,000 aircraft on the side of the RAF and their Canadian allies, of which 1,700 were destroyed. They would sustain 1,500 dead and 420 would be wounded. And the Luftwaffe, with their allies, from the Italians in the Corpo Aereo Italiano, they would have 2,500 aircraft, but they would sustain 2,000 destroyed aircraft, 2,600 dead, and 735 wounded, not to mention almost 1,000 captured airmen. What was also sort of prevalent, not necessarily in those statistics, was that there were rotations and sort of almost like a rota system for the RAF and Canadians. Because there were so many who had signed up to the RAF from all parts of the Commonwealth and all parts of the Empire, and also folks from Czechoslovakia and Poland and other places where they fled persecution from the Nazis, they were the British RAF and the Canadians were able to sort of rota out people so that there was always sort of like fresh airmen to repel the assaults by the Germans. Whereas the Germans just used the same people over and over again. There wasn't as many as they could have had. But although, you know, that being said, these statistics don't necessarily show much in the way of who fared better or who fared worse. I think the point of the Battle of Britain was that the Germans didn't necessarily realise the spirit and the sort of never giving up motif that the British would have, or that the Allies would have. And it's probably why they sort of moved away from their assault on Britain, because they knew that they couldn't hamper the spirits of the British or of the Allied forces. And that concludes this potted history on the Battle of Britain. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I hope that you have enjoyed this video. I realise that, you know, my background isn't exactly most colourful in the world, and my drawing is probably a little bit basic, but I still hope that I presented to you with good enough information, that it has been brief and yet detailed enough for you. Yeah, if you liked it, please do hit the like button down below, subscribe to the channel, make a comment on anything I might have missed or might be maybe slightly wrong about. But in the meantime, I'm going to leave it there. So without further ado, I will see you next week or in the next few days with a summer series video. Who knows? See you later.